Welcome everyone to Dying Your Way. And this podcast today is honored to have a very special guest, Molly Reynolds. She is a well-known director here in Australia. And we're going to be specifically looking at David Gulpilil, who is the subject of a film that is recently released. And we'll talk about that and talk about Aboriginal culture and their outlook on death and dying and access to good quality care in death and dying. So I think to give this context, it would just be better if I read a synopsis that is part of the media materials that was given to me. The great Australian actor David Gulpilil faces his own mortality. He is dying of lung cancer. Holding the camera figuratively in the palm of his hand, David performs directly for whoever might be out there in the future looking at him, to what is for him his final audience. He talks about what it is to stare down death and what it was to live a life such as he did, a dizzying mix of traditional Aboriginal ways of life and modern Hollywood excess, and everything that comes in between that. It is pure and unvarnished in David Gulpilil, finally able to say in a film exactly what he wants to say. He reminisces about his films and his fame and the effects of both on a tribal boy from the Northern Territory. He talks about acting and how dancing in his own culture is really the basis of what made him famous. And now he looks towards going home to his own funeral, the specifications of which he is very particular about. He's visited by his sisters, including his twin, Mary, and they plan for his passing. So David is dying of stage 4 lung cancer. And today it's just a real honor to introduce you to the director of this film. My name is Gulpilil, by Molly Reynolds. Here's Molly.
Thank you, Claire, for that very fine introduction.
It's a pleasure to meet you. And I just want to say I have had my whole Australian education by my Australian husband by watching Australian films. And I have looked at the list of all of the 25 some odd films that he has been in, and I had already seen 8 of them. And then since knowing that we were going to be doing this interview, I've seen 10 more. And I saw that, I want to be sure I'm saying the name of my name is Gulpilil. I'm probably destroying the pronunciation of that.
No, not bad, Claire. It's Gulpilil. So just that final L.
Gulpilil.
Gulpilil. And one of the reasons why the documentary is titled My Name is Gulpilil because throughout David's performing career, he's had to endure many different versions of his name.
Oh,
and
sure.
So, yes, it's oh, you're close. You're very close.
Well, but I did see the film on ABC, iView, before this was even in my wheelhouse that I was going to be doing an interview with you. And it was mesmerizing. It was just haunting. It was so raw and funny and unbelievable in some ways that someone has led the kind of life that he has led. He's just truly a iconic, amazing human being. I mean, you lose words.
Yeah, David, I think David is a very magnetic, compelling person. He is someone who was born in the bush and was sort of grew up in his culture. He didn't learn English until he found himself on a film set, and that film set was a film called Walkabout by an English filmmaker called Nicholas Roeg.
Yeah.
And Nicholas Roeg was looking, as David says in the film, for someone who could dance, who could sing, who could, who could sort of do it all, who could perform. And all the elders in the community said, "Yep, him, David Gulpilil. He is our person of talent." And so he was cast, and the rest is history, really.
Yeah. It's just amazing. And I also he's had so many awards, and I noticed that an artist who did his painting got the Archibald Prize, which that's another thing that people in the United States don't know about, but it's just this amazing honor for artists that do different portraits primarily, and David's portrait won in 2004, I believe.
Yes, that was a portrait by Craig Ruddy,
Mm.
with whom David has a relationship, and I think it speaks to how artistic David is, that he can sort of, even the notion of him posing for a portrait, an artist can bring out those elusive qualities of David, because it is, it's quite a portrait by Craig, absolutely. And David has traveled the world as a singer, and he's done a few tours into America, where he dined with Clint Eastwood. Apparently they had beer steak together, and he really quite enjoyed that journey. And Chuck Norris, he's really, he's hobnobbed with the celebrities of the world.
And with the Queen of England.
Oh, David is very partial to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth of England. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and David is also a painter himself. And you can see in the documentary some of his really very fine works that he's painted in recent times.
So we saw it on ABC iView, the film, which anyone around the world could get on ABC iView. And
no.
No.
It's only available to Australians because it's geocached, but the film does have a distributor in the US, Visit Films, and they are sales agents, sorry, but they're planning for the film to be seen in the rest of the world.
That's great. So tell me, when and how did you meet David? I mean, I see that you have a very strong bond with each other, but how did that meeting come about?
I often joke, but it's sort of half serious, I suppose. I first met David as a child in a film called Storm Boy. Storm Boy was based on a classic Australian novel about a young boy who lives with his father, out in the wilds along the coastline of Australia. And the young boy takes in 3 penguins, and there's David plays Fingerbone Bill, who sort of helps nurture the boy into the into the world. And then I met David in Ramingining, which is his home country, about 20 years ago. He happened to be there while I was there, but I really came to know David when he came and stayed at my home with my partner Rolf, because David was the storyteller in a film of Rolf's called 10 Canoes. And so that's when I came to know David.
Yeah, I haven't seen Storm Boy, but every other movie that you've talked about, I've seen. So, oh my goodness. Well, that's wonderful. So he has stage 4 lung cancer. I'm assuming he certainly has a wonderful carer that is Mary, who's staying with him and seems devoted to him. Where is he right now? Is he in Melbourne or where is he?
We, as you know, Australia, well, obviously you live here, we're sort of carved up into states, not unlike the US. And he lives in South Australia, and he lives in a town just outside the capital city there called Murray Bridge. And he was living there when he was diagnosed with his cancer, and he was diagnosed in March 2017. And Rolf and I had gone to pay our respects to David and see how he was faring. And he was so keen to work because work is his lifeblood. He lives for the camera. And so we struck upon making this documentary. And the original plan with the documentary was to finish with David's death ceremonies up in his country. But with each passing year, David transcended the odds, and he extensively was recovering. And in that, we thought, well, we'll finish the documentary now instead of waiting for his demise, because it looked like we were going to wait a long time.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's really unusual to have a stage 4 person have such longevity. So just for listeners out there, it does happen, there. But I'm really, I was impressed in the film with the quality of care that he was getting, and the support network that he had. And is that unusual?
No, he's very fortunate in that his carer Mary was trained as a nurse, so she has that sort of confidence that other people might not have, and David has made that. It has not been an easy choice. It's been a very, very fraught choice for him to take. He feels as though he has a white fella's disease, and so he will need white fella's medicine to keep him alive. So he's made that choice to stay in Adelaide or near Adelaide, because he's able to access world-class care, which has made a difference to his mortality, undeniably so. But that he can't return back to country, and
he cannot return back to country?
No. It's an isolated place. As he says in a documentary that we make together, it's easier to fly to England to see the Queen than it is to get to his country, because you've got to fly from the south of Australia to the top. There's 7 hours in that. Then you need a connecting flight to a township like probably not Maningrida, maybe Maningrida, and then another connecting flight into Ramangini. And while there's a clinic there, it's baseline care. It's about keeping people well, or keeping them okay until they can get to Darwin for the next level of care. So if David returned to his township, he wouldn't last very long. He's not robust enough to return. So yes, he has that difficult choice, because
explain to the audience how important it is for an Aboriginal person to return to where they were born as part of their end of life journey. I mean, if you could.
Look, I'll sort of our First Nations people are spread, all over Australia, and it's almost like Europe, in that culturally there's a great deal of difference. I know the Yolngu community of northeast. even more precise. I know a community based around the township of Ramingining. They're Yolngu people, and the Yolngu peoples live in northeast Arnhem Land. And so what I can speak to is my experience there. And it is culturally we're so different that my insights are limited. But I do have relationship and connection with a few people, like David and Peter Jigger, who's his kingship son, and who Rolf and I have done a lot of work with. Mm-hmm. And what I've come to understand is the nature of interconnectedness that the Yolngu people have, which they have it to their country, to the earth, to one another, to the skies, to the stars. It is all interconnected and yet also very, very fluid. And it is, my understanding is that, you know, as Peter Jigger has said so eloquently, his bones are in the earth, his ancestors' bones are in the earth. So there's a connection to country that us Westerners, I don't think in our paradigm can really begin to appreciate. And so it's an internal crisis for David to be so far away from country. But at the same time, he chooses to be alive and not dead. Sure. Where he gets some comfort, I think, is that he knows, partly because we have promised, we as in at least Rolf and I, we promise this because we can do it, is to get his body back to the township, back to his peoples, so that they can begin the ceremonies and do what is right and proper. And so David can once again become a fish in the water hole. Yeah.
And that's what his name means, kingfisher, right?
Well, interestingly, yes, it does. It's very, again, it's a complex thing, because someone like David will have a number of totems, and depending on where he is or who he's with, his totem will change. Mm-hmm. And so it speaks to, again, interconnectedness and the fluidness of that. And so David, depending on circumstance, will attach to different totems. But yes, Gulpilil does mean kingfisher.
Yeah. Well, it was, and I watched your documentary, Another Country, last night, and it really kind of explained the film that I guess your husband did before. It's a suite.
Charlie's Country?
Charlie's Country.
Yes.
So I saw Charlie's Country, and then I saw your documentary, and it really explained to me the fictional Charlie's Country with Another Country, which is a documentary that you did, that really tied it up for me to understand, really the clash of the cultures with Black fellows, white fellows, being able to, I felt like that they were trying to be kind by assimilating into allowing the missionaries and people to come into their world. And, now they're just totally told or feel like they're told what to do at every turn.
Now, maybe Claire, we should back up here just for your listeners, and
please.
And I shall explain to them that David has had a long-standing relationship with my partner Rolf de Heer, and Rolf cast David in his first lead role in a film called The Tracker at the turn of the century, which is kind of rather gobsmacking that it took so long for a man of that immense talent to have a lead role. they collaborated together on a film called 10 Canoes, which was Australia's first in-language indigenous film. And then, that was when I had come to know David. And David had a really rough patch in his life. He is a man of two worlds, and he was also a man who had certain predilections, and is, as he admits in My Name is Gulpilil, was an drug and alcoholic. He very much liked to smoke marijuana and drink alcohol to excess. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he and he could behave very badly in those circumstances. He went to prison twice for driving over the limit and drunken and disorderly. And then he went to prison for domestic violence, throwing a broom at his wife, Miriam. And so he went to jail. And during that period of time, he never drank alcohol again. Took him a little bit longer to wean himself off marijuana, which he no longer smokes. But while he was in prison, Rolf went to visit David, and David and Rolf would discuss what David would do upon release, and he really wished to make a film, and he wished to make it with Rolf. Now, Rolf is both a director and a producer and a very pragmatic filmmaker. And so he thought, okay, how can I, give the best way for David to shine? And it was to create a story, which it was called Charlie's Country, in which it was sort of very true to David's peers, to bush indigenous men, who had a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge, but were just adrift in the Western world, and all that went wrong with that. And Rolf and I and David had successfully collaborated historically around the time of 10 Canoes with films called The Ballender and the Bark Canoes and 12 Canoes. So we thought we would make another suite of films, Enter Another Country. Mm-hmm. Now, Another Country is a documentary which sort of speaks to the cultural problems between the two. And I think it can be summed up, and David is the storyteller in Another Country, and he says, This is why our two cultures don't get on. And we sum it up in time because, Yolngu culture, they view time differently. It is not measured as we measure it. There's rubbish, because you're looking at a culture that had no experience of rubbish until, 50 years ago, where everything they use, they just throw over their shoulder and know that when they had come back, it had disintegrated into country and money, because Yolngu culture, you have obligation, and that obligation is important when you're depending on the land for your survival, for your food, for your shelter. You have obligation to look after other people and share. And that, when it comes to money, gets really, really complicated. And so, yes, so David was the narrator in that documentary, and it also, which is where you were going, Claire, speaks to the sort of the history of white, the white culture, the dominant culture, and how they've tried to manage our indigenous situation with a whole lot of policies, which effectively, David says, they're not working, they haven't worked. These are the reasons why.
Yeah, and it's clearly stated, because how it's stated is so visual. Yeah. I mean, you're seeing visually what he's saying in very few words, like a wise sage, and you're seeing the people that get money that is a dole that they get from the government, and then they get it, and then they just give it to people that are in their circle, and then they run out of money, and they, it's such a catch-22, because seeing the harsh rules that seem to only apply to Aboriginals, that you can't be around someone who is a heavy drinker and give them alcohol, or you're going to go to jail. And it's just, it seems so, well,
it's
it,
wrong.
it doesn't meet their needs for understanding what it is they're supposed to do. And at the same time, it's so heavy-handed compared to what would happen if you were a white fella.
Exactly. It is quite simply wrong that we have got young Indigenous males going to prison for things that non-Indigenous males would do, and and not be penalized for. It's
Yeah.
a it's
Meet the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean,
yeah.
it's very it's very similar. And I've spent some time in New Zealand and have seen the integration of the Maori culture with the Anglo culture in New Zealand, and it's very different than my experience here of the blending of the Aboriginal culture with the Anglo culture here.
Yeah, I think they say there are whole it's different, but I think one of the reasons that the Maoris and the Pakeha they have a different dynamic, and that is because a treaty was negotiated.
Treaty. Yeah.
Where in Australia we just came in, and Terry Annullis said, no one live here, this can be claimed. And so I think it early on a completely different dynamic set up. And also that, as I mentioned earlier, that in Australia, our Indigenous peoples are incredibly diverse, culturally, and by the time you work your way from one end of Australia to another, you've got different languages, there's not the means to communicate. And so that's the difference between us and New Zealand as well.
I've just noticed, I mean, maybe it's been like 3 or 4 years that I've been going back and forth between the United States and Australia, but I really have noticed a difference in an awareness and an acknowledgement of country in whether you want to call it, now it's politically correct to do it. I see more of it, and that is might be because of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, but I think, and I'm speaking as a white person, the privilege that we have just grown up with and lived our lives, is it's, I'm becoming aware, I'll just speak for myself, I'm becoming aware that I have not been, well, I've probably been I have grandchildren that are mixed race, and, I love that hybrid vigor, but yeah, there is just a real need for diversity in Australia, in my opinion, that is so prevalent in New Zealand, and it's prevalent in the United States too. Granted, with its problems, but
So from your perspective, you think that there is more diversity in the US with your First Peoples than there is in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, it's
Wow.
it's not, I mean, you could point anecdotally that that's not true, but yeah, I mean, it depends on where you live in the United States. I spent a lot of my time in LA, so I was around diversity all the time, and it's different where you live, but yeah, the treaty in New Zealand really seemed to make a huge difference, and it bleeds into quality of life at the end of life, and the access to good quality care that is lacking depending on what your zip code is, your postcode. Yeah.
Oh yes, indeed. In Australia, the life expectancies of our Indigenous peoples is way lower than, and I think it's inherently fraught from a government and political perspective, because the money has been invested into care, and but it's just not translating in any meaningful way to improve life, life expectancy. It is, yeah, it's just very fraught within Australia, very fraught.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I know that they have, the government for everyone has aged care packages, but if you're not getting to that age, I mean, there just needs, I have been talking to a lot of people here that there are hopefully going to be changes in public policy, for end of life care. And I see it, now with the new government in the United States, there's a real possibility to improve that there as well.
I think that it's a curious one, and I will speak again to the Yolngu mob up in Ramingining, and there are really practical issues like isolation, but again, where there's a really very, very complex thing is the notion of care and how you care, because within Yolngu culture, your nature of your relationship changes. So if you become a very, very old man, then you will be, as an old man, and in our culture, let's say a grandfather, what happens is that old man will then become the son of a middle-aged man, and that is because the middle-aged man can better take care of the old man. So it's a very, to kind of find care, the notion of sort of structured care and support, and apply it to a different culture when it's sort of been crafted for a Western culture.
Yeah,
is hard.
I see that. Thank you for clarifying that. You see, that was just sort of an audacious white privilege thing I just said. So
no, because it, in many ways, everybody, we should have universal access to care and to health and medicine and things like that. So in that way, that's very much the right principle. It's just the notion of how complex it gets, and how do you tailor it to people with different needs.
I have another question, because again, one of the first things as an American, when I'm watching the Australian news, that I noticed was they would always come on and say to their audience, that there's a warning that there are pictures depicting people that have passed away, because that is something that is problematic for people in the Aboriginal community. And yet, in this incredible film, My Name is Gulpilil, he is talking to the camera in a way that he's inviting the audience to hear his words and hear his message after he's gone. So explain that to me.
Okay, that is complex, and I will use 10 Canoes as a way to speak to it. I think what had happened was, until the turn of the century, until smartphones, many of our isolated communities would not even have television, would be lucky to, many Indigenous peoples would be lucky to kind of reach adulthood without ever having watched a film. So then when came along the introduction of, let's say, television or playing back, footage of people who'd been shot, it was really, really confronting. Everyone would kind of jump back and go, oh my goodness, there are lives, the spirits, our ancestors have come back to us. And so it was really, really shocking. And it was, again, the dominant culture's way of managing that situation to provide a warning before all viewing. And now it's become convention. And it's incredibly complex. But I learned through the Yolngu mob at Ramingining with 10 canoes, because 10 canoes is basically set in, the community up there wanted to make a film that was of the good times, which was sort of pre-arrival of the English and the Dutch and everybody else like that. And so it's set, thousands of years ago. And Rolf, in consulting with the community, said, okay, then what about this disclaimer at the front of the film? And the elders sat around and they said, no, we need to progress with the times. We need to be a part of, we need to embrace and be a part of the mainstream society. No, we don't need it. So it's that warning is a complex thing. It's become a convention that our broadcasters use, and they dare not use it. But at the same time, it almost kind of locks our Indigenous peoples into a place and time. And again, at Ramingining, the community there, when they lose someone, they will not speak their name. David is going in the face of that. That's why he wanted his documentary to be called My Name is Gulpilil. But often they'll request pictures and video of those who have gone, because it's a reminder, as it is in our culture, to look at those we love. Yeah.
I love doing interviews where I'm learning things. This is wonderful. I just want the listeners to get on Netflix, get on anything, to get in a wealth of Australian films, and he's probably in most of them, but The Rabbit-Proof Fence, Tracker. Everyone's seen Nicole Kidman, Hugh Jackman in Australia, but there's just so much to learn from these films that really was denied to a global audience, because the US distributors, for I think since the 1930s until not that long ago, really were not letting Australian films be distributed in the United States. So that is, and now there's just this whole body of work that is, if you're into the artistry of filmmaking, the Australians really do an incredible job. And so much is about telling the Aboriginal story in unique ways that go beyond Crocodile Dundee. However, he was in that film too. So,
that he was, yes.
Yeah. Well, Molly, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to share with us about this film. And what are your plans going forward? Will you be doing other films of this genre, or what are your plans?
Oh, look, I'm just sort of recovering from Gulpilil. It has been 4 wonderful years of working with David, and we're just at the tail end of the release in Australia. So I think I'll pause, I'll take stock, and then it depends. It could go, Claire, one of two ways. Something could just drop in my lap and I can pick it up and run with it, or I might just go out there and seek it out. But I have no idea what that may be just yet.
Well, I will certainly follow your career, and I will follow the news about David Gulpilil. It's just, I am just really honored that you came onto this podcast and gave us such a unique perspective through David's eyes, for our listeners, and really appreciate meeting you, and best to you.
Yes, thank you, Claire.
Yeah, thank you.